Welcome to today's Attaining the Worlds Beyond review. We are reviewing chapter 28, which is Not for Oneself. It is very important for me to start every session with an expression of gratitude because we don't take anything for granted. So I want to thank all of you who have been supporting our review, sending off messages, sharing the videos to others, writing comments. We appreciate all of this. And most importantly, we appreciate you reading the book online because even if you can't buy the book physically, there is a link in the community, the Sage Wisdom Book Club. When you join, there is a link that takes you directly to the online book and you can read it for free whilst you follow us. So let's talk about chapter 28. For me, chapter 28, I want to start off by saying that it begins to give a picture that almost feel like I am now in a theater looking at the spiritual body of a human soul. It's not intellectual anymore, it's going deeper into all of what we've been talking about in previous chapters. Now we're looking at what is called the kilim of a person, which is the vessel that is used to do good to others. So it's very surreal for me. It is very surreal because very often we see a person physically, but here we are told that we have a spiritual body, which is similar to our physical body. And this chapter started with Not for Oneself. Well, it's a very interesting title by itself because not for oneself, what does this mean? I think to the average person, they will not even know what the heck this means. But by the time you read the book, go to the second or the third page of this chapter, you get the impression of what not for oneself actually means. It starts off with talking about life. What is life? We take everything for granted. We always say, this is life. You know, life goes on. We make statements like this. What the question is, what is life? For the first time, I read this definition of life that it is considered a state in which we perceive desires for attaining pleasure. Either we want pleasure for ourselves or we want pleasure for others. But the reality is, if we don't have a perception of pleasure, if we wake up in the morning or God forbid any time during the day and we suddenly lose this perception of pleasure, we will instantly go unconscious because we are not going to want to live in this world anymore. Every one of us wants to receive pleasure, whether we receive the pleasure for ourselves or the pleasure to do something good for the creator, to do good to others. But either way, we want to receive pleasure. And so this light that we're talking about, this is light of the creator, but this is the creator's light is actually felt to us as pleasure. How we use this pleasure is another thing completely. The book goes on to say that we need to get to this point because it's so important that we are in the state of receiving pleasure. We must use the pleasure to do good for the creator. I want to pass it over to Francis at this stage.
Yeah, thank you. So it's interesting. I was sitting here asking myself all the definitions we've had, concerning life. As a child growing up, I heard people say life is a war, life is a battle. But here I read that life is considered to be a state in which we perceive desires for attaining pleasure. And from there, I like to say that, just like Sheila said, receiving pleasure, has to be received. Our pleasure has to be received in the correct way. And what is the correct way of receiving pleasure? So we begin to understand the purpose of creation by receiving pleasure. in the correct way, and that is receiving pleasure without any calculation as to what, or giving pleasure without any calculation as to what is in it for me. In other words, there is no egoism in receiving pleasure from the Creator. But a person comes to a stage where receiving pleasure is entirely to bring pleasure to the Creator. But as she said, we need that vessel, what she mentioned as Kelim, of bestowal, through which we can actually receive pleasure and give that pleasure to the Creator or bring that pleasure to the Creator. So we begin with taking pleasure for ourselves, but we don't end there. We grow and we move on to a point where we receive pleasure for the sake of the Creator. So,
Thanks, Francis. For me, this chapter, not for oneself, it's the how to part. You know, when you go to YouTube and search how to do something, this is that chapter for me. It's we've been learning about the creator who's absolute good, who wants to delight all of creations, and how we need to change. But now we come to this chapter that actually give us the steps of how to actually come to that absolute goodness that we've been speaking about since the beginning of this chapter. And as Sheila said, we always receive pleasure for ourselves. And when we come to a point where we don't receive pleasure, we can faint, as it is read in this chapter, can faint or even die. Now, remember in the previous chapter we spoke about us receiving pleasures in three stages: in the past, the present, and the future. Now, when someone comes to the point where they cannot receive pleasure in their past, it was all bad. In their present, or even their future, they cannot even think of anything good in the future. That person feels that what is really the point of my life? And unfortunately, a person comes to end their life because they see that there is no pleasure. Now this chapter comes and tells us that the best way for us to actually receive the ultimate pleasure, that we cannot even describe it because we are still in this corporeal world. It's for us to begin to change the direction of what we are doing. Certain things, are we taking for ourselves or for the Creator? That's why this chapter, not for self, because when we take it for ourselves, it will always be very, very little, and we cannot even say we receive per se, because as soon as the pleasure comes into our vessels, it disappears. If you are thirsty, for example, you are very, very thirsty, the more you drink water, the less and less it becomes in the cup. You become more and more unthirsty. Your thirst becomes quenched to the point where you no longer want the water. So, receiving for ourselves kills our desire. In spirituality, it's the opposite. The more we receive in order to bestow for the others, the more it grows. Imagine eating something, and the more you eat it, the more you enjoy it more and more and more, but it doesn't really fill your stomach. That's what the Creator wants us to go. That's why this chapter, for not for ourselves, is teaching us. Deleuze.
Yes, beautiful friends. Thank you so much. I don't know how to really add on to that because the chapter, well, I do know, I'm going to try and add on. They speak of the different lights that we receive. And Sheila, you've mentioned about the fact that there is the spiritual body made out of these different desires, and they even have a number of desires that's spoken of, 248, that all of us have to go through at some stage to make them into altruistic acts, not just for ourselves, but for the Creator, for bringing contentment to the Creator. But to get to that state, you actually have to start with the first stage, which is for yourself. Apparently, these pleasures, you can't escape that. Now, I realized from my own upbringing, for instance, it was always thought of, well, just don't have any desire for myself. I'll just not even try and fulfill certain pleasures because otherwise I might be a sinner of some sort. But here we realize that we have these desires and we grow and we grow. And at some point, you'll get to the point where you say, well, I fulfilled all of those and I still feel quite hopeless and in despair. And then that question, of course, which we've, as you've said too, so we've discussed in the other chapters about why do I feel this sensations, this hollowness, this emptiness, etc. And now we get to these desires to want to be to do good, and we can do this good for ourselves. And then it's, as they mention in this chapter, the term called lishma and lo lishma. So first for myself, but that can't be maintained. That's not going to really get me anywhere. And through the study, through the process of reading, through the process of this exploration, you get to the phase of, you pray, you get to this phase of for the Creator. But we've touched on prayer as well and what prayer means. And it is this absolute constant request to be able to do this for the Creator. I'll hand it over to you, Sheila.
Okay, so going back to the structure of because for me, like I said, I felt as if I was now in a theater looking at the soul and looking at different parts of the spiritual body and what it does and how it's supposed to operate. And now a person has to elevate from the lower level to the higher level, which is the corrected vessels. And the sudden realization that we have this within us, but yet we cannot perceive it. And it's almost to me like something is instilled in us that is so vital. It's a purpose and it's yet concealed. But the importance of this is actually faith, because it takes us to this precious word that we talked about from the beginning. And I dare say, this is the foundation of reaching spirituality. You know, it's like you want to go to another country, you need a visa to get there. You cannot just enter another country without a visa unless you've been given a visa based on where you're coming from. That's it. You cannot just enter like that. Faith happens to be that visa that you need for spirituality. And the element of faith, not for oneself, is because everything about spirituality is hidden from our five senses. Yet that is what we need to overcome to reach this quality and this connection with the Creator. And that's where if this was not designed in this way, then faith would not have been important. Then we would have just known the Creator and that's it. Then all of this work will not be there for us to do. But the beauty of the concealment is the fact that you have to voluntarily choose to walk in the dark, in the expectation that you're walking in truth, in the belief that you are going to have a connection with something higher than yourself. And this is what is beautiful about it, but at the same time, very challenging. And this is where the title, Not for Oneself, comes into play, because ultimately, this process of you starting life with this desire for pleasure, but you're not going to have pleasure for the Creator, because the first pleasure you want is to fulfill yourself. And we have various ways. The book talks about different ways that you can do that. You can do that with food. You can do that with sex. You can do that with money, honor, recognition, all of that. But you have to come to this point where you have to walk in line with what the Bible tells us, because it tells us that everything that is written in the Bible is a commandment for us. But those commandments can never be fulfilled easily, because they are acts of goodness to others, and we don't have it naturally to do. And now to do so, we need to get to this point where we transform from for ourselves to for the Creator, which is Lishma. And with that said, I don't know, because we've reached our 15-minute review. We will continue this because we haven't finished the chapter yet. We will continue next week to bring it to a conclusion. Delis, do you want to say something?
Yes, and I thought the
Okay.
chapter was
You were
short, and I thought,
smiling, so I
okay,
thought
we'll
you
get
wanted to say
through this.
something.
We'll do this easily, and of course, each chapter is actually so deep that we have to come back to it. Absolutely.
Absolutely, yes. It's one of those things that I found about this book. You think a short chapter means quick read. No, it doesn't, because you
No.
always have to go up, back, down, reflection. Then it's even one part of the book referred you to another book, which I'm keen to look at that book. So see you all next week so that we can all enjoy the rest of our weekend. Take care and see you next week.